Baryonyx.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome the Baryonyx to the park.
Spinoceratops.
Can a dinosaur be considered cute? This species, the Spinoceratops, might just fit the bill. Despite having a similar appearance to the Sinoceratops, this animal is a
Spinoraptor.
The Spinoraptor is a predatory hybrid, synthesized from Spinosaurus and Velociraptor DNA. I've never dealt with an animal that seemed to want to hunt our guests quite as much as this.
Spinosaurus. Suchomimus.
The Suchomimus is one fearsome animal. Don't worry though, it mainly eats fish and other small prey. So unless you're paddling around in its enclosure, you should be safe. But just
Acrocanthosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Acrocanthosaurus to the park.
Allosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Allosaurus to the park.
Atrociraptor.
Underestimate the Atrociraptor and it could be the last thing you ever do. This dinosaur is a lethal predator. And worse, I've heard rumors of them getting trained to attack specific targets. We should give our animals a better life than that.
Ceratosaurus.
spikes, horns, and ridges. The Ceratosaurus is covered in defensive and offensive ornamentation. Let's treat it.
Compsognathus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Compsognathus to the park.
Deinonychus.
You know, I have a real soft spot for the Deinonychus. Of course, that's exactly the spot it would target with those massive claws if I ever got to...
Dimetrodon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dimetrodon to the park.
Giganotosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Giganotosaurus to the park.
Herrerasaurus.
We are pleased to welcome a Herrerasaurus to the park.
Indoraptor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Indoraptor to the park.
Albertosaurus.
The team just told me some fun facts about the Albertosaurus. Apparently, they have serrated, flesh-ripping teeth, show pack behavior, and like nothing more than
RCHAEONRNITHOMINUS.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Archaeornithomimus to the park.
Carnotaurus.
This animal is a classic predator. The Carnotaurus can move fast, has an excellent sense of smell, and is willing to sink its teeth into anything or...
Coelophysis.
Back when Coelophysis first evolved, all of Earth's land masses were combined into one big supercontinent. It's no surprise then that we found its fossilized remains all over the world. Oh,
Concavenator.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Concavenator to the park.
Dilophosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dilophosaurus to the park.
Gallimimus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Gallimimus to the park.
Guanlong.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Guanlong to the park.
Indominus Rex.
There was a time where I had nothing but respect for the great minds behind this hybrid. The rustics?
Metriacanthosaurus.
Now I respect its creators far less, but the Indominus Rex itself still demands awe.
The Metriacanthosaurus is a whole lot faster than it looks. And it's definitely faster than I look, which is why I won't be going anywhere near this one, thank you very much.
Moros intrepidus.
Ah, the Moros intrepidus. The word moros comes from the ancient Greek spirit of impending doom. Rather morbid, I know, but it does paint a picture of what guidance this dinosaur
Oviraptor.
will prove a much cheerier addition to the site.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Oviraptor to the park.
Triceratosaurus.
If you were looking for a reason to be amazed by modern science, then look no further. The Proceratosaurus was identified from a very limited fossil record, and yet enough of it have this dinosaur here.
Kiangosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Changosaurus to the park.
Struthiomus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Struthiomimus to the park.
Ornithomimus.
The Ornithomimus, or bird mimic, has a remarkably large brain for its size. The area's dedicated to move, fitting for a dinosaur that can reach
Pachycephalosaurus.
such impressive speeds. It makes you wonder if bird brain is as savage an insult as some might think.
Here we have the Pachycephalosaurus, which is the ancient Greek way of saying thick-headed lizard. I take it as a compliment.
Pyraptor.
Well, I like it from afar, at least. They can get a bit, headbutty for my liking.
This one feels like it's straight out of legend. Get this. A forest fire sweeps through southern France, and what's found in dinosaurs?
Scorpius
Glad
rex.
to have it with us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Scorpius Rex to the park.
Stygia
Stygimoloch is a gentle giant most of the time. Until they're spooked, at least. In the wild, that's...
Truden.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Troodon to the park.
Utahraptor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Utahraptor to the park.
Eutyrannus.
the feathered tyrant. Eutyrannus. Now this tyrannosaur ruffled a few feathers when it was first discovered.
Therizinosaurus.
We are pleased to welcome a Therizinosaurus to the park.
Tyrannosaurus rex.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Tyrannosaurus Rex to the park.
Velociraptor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Velociraptor to the park.
Ankylosaurus.
We are pleased to welcome an ankylodicus to the park.
Brachiosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Brachiosaurus to the park.
Chunkingosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Chunkingosaurus to the park.
Diplodocus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Diplodocus to the park.
Dryosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dryosaurus to the park.
Ankylosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Ankylosaurus to the park.
Gallimimus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Gallimimus to the park.
Chasmosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Chasmosaurus to the park.
Corythosaurus. Dreadnoughtus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dreadnoughtus to the park.
Sinoceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome Sinoceratops to the park.
Homalocephalae.
The Homalocephalae might seem unassuming, but that flat plate on its head isn't there for decoration. I've seen it used socially amongst the dinosaurs, but I've also seen it used.
Herrerasaurus.
The name Kentrosaurus supposedly means prickle lizard. Considering it can swing that spiky tail at.
Stegoceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Stegoceratops to the park.
Lystrosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Lystrosaurus to the park.
Mamenchisaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Mamenchisaurus to the park.
Struthiomus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome the Struthiomimus to the park.
Nodosaurus.
Like me, this animal, the Nodosaurus, is shy and likes to keep to itself. Okay, not like me, huh?
Rchaeonrnithomimus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Archaeornithomimus to the park.
Apatosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Apatosaurus to the park.
Ornithomimus.
The pleased to welcome an ornithomimus to the park.
Pachycephalosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Pachycephalosaurus to the park.
Patagotitan.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Patagotitan to the park.
Sinoceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Sinoceratops to the park.
Stegoceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Stegoceratops to the park.
Struthiomus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Struthiomimus to the park.
Syntosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome
Styracosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Styracosaurus to the park.
Triceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased.
Iguanodon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an iguanodon to the park.
Locusiraptor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Lokiceratops to the park.
Myosaura.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Myosaura to the park.
Microceritus. Sinoceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Sinoceratops to the park.
Stegoceratops.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Stegoceratops to the park.
Struthiomus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Struthiomimus to the park.
Edmontosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an Edmontosaurus to the park.
Giganspinosaurus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Giganspinosaurus to the park.
Nasutocerats.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome the Pseudoceratops to the park.
Olorodoton.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome Analora Titan to the park.
Oviraptor.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome an
Parasaurolophus.
The unique crest of the Parasaurolophus isn't just majestic, but functional too. Its uses are myriad, from communication
Psittacosaurus.
We are pleased to welcome a Psittacosaurus to the park.
Atenborosaurus. Dunkleosteus. Ichthyosaurus. Kronosaurus. Megalodon.
Ladies and
Mosasaurus. Plesiosaurus. Kaiwajara.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Kaiwajara to the park.
Dimorphodon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Dimorphodon to the park.
Geos.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Geosternbergia to the park.
Pteranodon.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Pteranodon to the park.
Quetzalcoatlus.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to welcome a Quetzalcoatlus to the park.